I want to start off by probably what was the best trip I ever did for the BBC, which was back in 1991 in Sevastopol in the Crimea, and now obviously very much a point of contention again, seized by the Russians from Ukraine. This is autumn 1991. It's the Royal Marine Band on the quayside at Sevastopol, and it's the visit of HMS Fearless, I think it was the Dartmouth Academy sort of flagship at the time. And it was the first Royal Navy visit to Sevastopol for 40 years. If you think the Cold War was slowly coming to an end, we just had the hardline coup against Gorbachev, I think a few weeks before. It was still very much the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union was very much on decline. And one of the places we visited was Balaclava Harbour, and this is Balaclava Harbour as we saw it. And if you see there on the top right-hand corner, you see the ruins of the Phoenician lighthouse that was there. Balaclava was by this time a Soviet submarine base. This is a painting back in the day of the Crimea War itself, and you can see the same little Phoenician lighthouse on the right. And as we were walking along the quayside, one of the Royal Navy photographers who was with us had his camera over his shoulder, and he was clicking away, at this, which was a submarine that nobody had ever seen before. It's a Soviet Beluga class submarine, very early version. And I said to him, what are you doing? And he said, oh, shh, don't say a word, don't draw any attention. And I said, well, for goodness sake, there's an ITN TV crew filming the whole thing there. The Russians just don't care anymore. The Cold War is over, nobody bothers. And in fact, the next day I went across to the Soviet naval base, the main Soviet naval base, and British Ministry of Defence guy insisted on coming with me because he feared that there was going to be a terrible diplomatic incident. And I marched up to the guard at the naval base, and I said my two of my 4 words of Russian. I said, "Correspondent, BBC, England. Can I come in?" And the guy said, yeah, of course you can come in. And I wandered around this naval base where there was a scene of kind of ecological destruction. There was a minesweeper sunk at its moorings. There were chemical drums leaking left, right, and center. It was an extraordinary shift from the Soviet superpower that we had known before. And again, this view with the Phoenician lighthouse up on the top left there, that's as it was back at the time of the Crimea War, with the Phoenician lighthouse just there. Now, of course, the Crimea was one of the first conflicts where journalism had a significant role to play, and indeed photography. And certainly post facto, after the event of the war, the reports of William Howard Russell in the Times had a significant role in drawing the British public's attention to the problems of the British military, its archaic practices, and so on. And one of the main things I want to, talk to you about now is, as I say, to emphasize, is this idea of change. We've gone through 9/11, the Balkans, Afghanistan, Iraq, the Cold War, counterterrorism, what we call hybrid war now, and perhaps a return to a Cold War of sorts with China. We live in a very different society. You might argue less patriotic, more risk averse, perhaps, more questioning. The military experience for most people is very distant. In the world that I'm sure we all grew up in, I remember, the major up the road, a major from the Second World War, the colonel up the road, again from the Second World War. Conscription, of course, has ended by that time. And as time has gone on, as the military in many countries, particularly in our own, has become a smaller and smaller segment of the population, so the military experience is that much more distant from the run-of-the-mill population. The media has changed dramatically too. It's much more diverse, it's much more politicized, much more market-driven. When I started, every single newspaper, every single news outlet had a professional defence correspondent, often people who had had some military experience themselves. The BBC actually had 2 defence correspondents. We've then gone through extraordinary technological change in the media, which I will touch on in a moment. But of course, relations between the media and the military have always been difficult. This is General Sherman, Union commander in the American Civil War. And you can see he didn't have much time for the media. He says, I say in giving intelligence to the enemy and sowing discord and discontent, these men fulfill all the conditions of spies. And that kind of hostility, that fundamental sense of suspicion about the media has really pervaded relations between journalists and the military, certainly up until the time I started doing journalism. You had the idea that the media had lost Vietnam. That was an idea which even many senior British military figures had taken from their American counterparts. One of the things I think that changed relations significantly was the conflict in Northern Ireland, albeit an internal conflict in the British Isles, but one where the army in particular had to develop much better, closer, regular, routine relationship with journalists and the media. Now, of course, the Falklands War was not run by the army in terms of the media. It was run by the Navy. And the Navy had had very little modern experience, if you like, of operating with the media. There was censorship. You couldn't even say there was censorship, but there was. The word censored was censored out of reports. That's why Brian Hanrahan, my colleague, used his famous sentence when asked about the potential losses from an airstrike. And he said, I'm not allowed to say how many planes joined the raid, but I counted them all out, in his famous phrase, and I counted them all back. Journalists were entirely dependent on naval satellite communications, which was often denied. For a very significant part of the war, there were no television pictures. There was just a radio, if you like, on the television with still photos of the correspondents concerned. A very small number of correspondents were allowed to embark with the task force. They were all British. And even the whole mechanics of information handling by the government and by the Ministry of Defence was pretty haphazard. For example, when on the 4th of May, HMS Sheffield was hit by an Exocet missile at around 1400 GMT, the government wouldn't confirm anything. By early evening, political sources were telling the BBC that indeed the warship had been hit and very severely damaged. And the government only got its act together by the 9 o'clock news that evening, when the news was actually interrupted and it went to a official broadcast from the Ministry of Defence, the famous Mr. MacDonald, Ian MacDonald, the government spokesman, who finally confirmed the news to the nation. And I think that underscores, some of the elements of control that in the past the military were able to exert over journalists. This is post-Falklands. It's me interviewing the commander of HMS Triumph, who, funnily enough, I was at university with. But if the Falklands War was, as some people said, the worst reported war since the Crimea, it's partly because of the context. The Navy controlled access, it controlled the elements of transmission, and it's exactly like that here. We're out somewhere off the Scottish coast. We've just boarded from a tender on the left, and we're there alone, entirely dependent on officialdom for being able to get the message across. This is the war to liberate Kuwait. A rather different war, but again, relatively limited access directly to the front line. The embedding system that came subsequently in the Iraq War and so on hadn't been much developed by then. There was very, very good press center set up in Saudi Arabia, but you could still do a fair bit of on your own. I mean, I reported on this from London, and then I went out to Kuwait pretty much immediately as the forces entered Kuwait City. There's a transmitter button that I pulled out of one of those tanks at the Mutler Ridge, which was probably a fairly stupid thing to do, my press pass. And this, the picture we opened with, is actually in Iraq. That's my vehicle there. Only an idiot would put white V markings on a white vehicle, but I suppose we didn't have any black tape. But this is in Iraq. We tried to get into Iraq, being stopped on the main road by American tanks. So we veered off to the northeast. This is actually looking towards Qasr naval base. You can see some cranes on the left-hand side. And we were driving along a road past this line of Bradley American armored vehicles, which we didn't know was the furthest the Americans had advanced. And we saw a Humvee chasing us with guys waving wildly. And we stopped, and they luckily told us that we'd just gone into Iraq and invited us to turn around and join them, which we very happily did. Of course, one of the great changes of the Gulf War was so-called Scud FM, the predecessor of 5 Live Radio, a live news channel that was able to constantly adapt and report on stories as they emerged. We didn't, of course, have here a 24-hour news television at that point. Then we go on to Bosnia. I went up to Bosnia I went up to Vitez with the Cheshires, Colonel Bob Stewart, when they first arrived in Croatia, and then drove inland. Very restrictive rules set by the UN at that stage. In theory, we couldn't even go in a UN vehicle. We couldn't expect any support from the UN. But Bob Stewart was fantastic. He gathered all the British journalists together and said, if you get into trouble, my boys will come and get you. Don't worry. And again, the technology was improving. We had satellite phones by now, huge, great things that you needed, a vehicle to move, like in a great trunk. But you were able to get news out relatively quickly. And I remember being in Vitez, which was a sort of, the headquarters building was like a 1960s British comprehensive school. It was that style of architecture, a school that they had taken over. And I remember being outside the ops room there and hearing a contact radio message come in, the first time that the British forces had been fired on. And we were able to clarify what had happened, or as best what had happened, get the satellite phone up and get that on the BBC probably within about a half an hour or so, which was a huge, huge step forward. We then go on to the Iraq War, another huge step forward. By then, you have the real impact of live 24-hour news, such that you could sit and watch CNN and wait for the war to begin as you saw the bombs falling on Baghdad. We kind of knew when it was going to begin because there was a huge drinks party and dinner paid for by the Sun newspaper for all the senior British officers. I was at CENTCOM at the time in the Gulf, and in theory they were all going to stay the night because they all expected, I suppose, to drink rather too much. And in the event, most of them didn't drink too much, and they went back, and we all assumed then that night the war was going to start. And sure enough, we watched it on CNN. There were some 5,000 journalists in the region covering the conflict by now. As I say, I was at CENTCOM in Qatar. Some 700 of these journalists were embedded. In other words, they were operating with each of the units involved in the campaign. About 16 journalists were actually killed as a result in the first very intense 2 weeks of combat. But the great thing about the embedded reporters was that you got eyes on the ground. Now, you've got very particular eyes. Sometimes you got very expert eyes. Sometimes you got very inexpert eyes. But if you knew who was with which unit, and you knew what was the unfolding sort of picture, as it were, you could piece together the jigsaw quite well. And that's what I was doing at CENTCOM, and I was providing that every day for pretty much all of the BBC radio and television, and indeed by that stage, I think, online outlets. And the reason I've got this silly map from the start of Dad's Army is that the way I worked there is that every morning I would go and see a guy called Simon Wren, who was the chief British press officer, who I knew very, very well. And he would come from the headquarters, where there was literally a big screen with all of the units and their markers identified. And we would have a briefing where I would draw a freehand map of Iraq, and I would draw an arrow like this, and he would say, no, 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 further to the west. And I'd say by this afternoon, and he'd say, no, middle of the next night. And I would get a very, very good picture. Now, obviously, I wasn't going to go and broadcast in advance exactly what was happening, but it did give me, between that, and I mean, that's another example of the maps that I was drawing, it gave me a very good idea of how things were unfolding and the sort of matrix in which I could piece the various individual news reports that were coming from the embedded correspondents themselves. And this business of experience and inexperience in correspondence, it may shock you, but I mean, most young people today don't make airfix kits. They can't name you every World War II fighter aircraft and so on, as perhaps people in my generation could. And I remember, you know, very early in the Iraq War, there was a terrible tragedy. Two Sea King helicopters collided, and a significant number of British Special Forces went into the water and were killed. And I actually got a phone call from a fairly senior BBC editor who told me that probably I would be coming home now because the war wouldn't happen. Well, that shows you the kind of level of sort of military understanding that people had. I want to look a little bit now again at some of the technical stuff that we do, just to give you a historical parallel. Very bad picture. The uniforms are all wrong, which just shows you you've got to be very careful about historical sources. But the Waterloo Dispatch, the famous dispatch that told of Wellington's victory in Belgium, left Brussels in the hands of Henry Percy of the 14th Light Dragoons on the 19th of June, and travelling via Ostend and Broadstairs, it arrived in the morning 3 days later. Well, how things gradually change. That's the way things were done in World War II, recording in the field onto a gramophone disc that had to be sent to a station way in the rear, and it could be then sent on to London. On the left is what I started with in '85, a Ewer, a reel-to-reel tape recorder that was incredibly heavy. And if it dropped from the strap on your shoulder, which it often did, it usually did significant damage to your ankles. On the right, what I ended up with, tiny little digital recorder, looks like a shaver, but it's about that size, a complete transformation in the technology that we use. Similarly, your iPhone, frankly, is a mobile journalism studio. This is a picture of a particular program, an electronic news gathering program that we have. And as you can see there, you can do film, you can do stills, you can use the microphone to record sound. And by just pushing one button, you can direct that to a particular point in the BBC where all parts of the organization can use the material. And the internet now means you can record from anywhere, you can broadcast from anywhere. That's me being interviewed, I think, on the way back from a NATO meeting on the Eurostar. Looks like it's still possibly in France, but in fact, I think it's certainly still in France. But you can broadcast from anywhere. I'm afraid it isn't all about going to exciting or glamorous places. Probably about 80% of stuff you do from your hotel room, very early in the morning or very late at night. But this extraordinary access that we have now and our extraordinary ability to look at sources from all over the world, the relative expertise or lack of expertise amongst some journalists poses all sorts of problems for officialdom. This is just one small episode. This is the BBC website story, which quotes me, the night the Serbs shot down an F-117 aircraft over Kosovo. I remember I was there with a colleague, Mark Leahy, and we'd done a deal. He would do one night on call, I'd do the next. It happened that this went down on my night, turned up outside NATO in the middle of the night with a cameraman. We're looking on a monitor at grainy pictures from Serbian TV. And of course, they say to you, well, what do you think it is? Luckily, I made lots of aeroplanes when I was little, and I still kept quite an interest in them. And I mean, there was no doubt it was an F-117 from some of the particular elements of the design of the debris. That's what I said there. I think on the television, I was even much more affirmative that it was. They had an expert on who told me it was a Danish F-16, and it was absolutely clear, Dutch F-16, and it was clear from the numbers that was utter rubbish. I actually knew him very well. He's a nice guy. So I said, well, we're all looking at grainy photos. None of us can be sure, but as far as I'm concerned, it's an F-117. Of course, NATO initially had to deny that the plane was shot down, and it took them quite a while, I think, to catch up. And we've moved now into something which is called warfare in the grey zone, or hybrid warfare. This really rather extraordinary state that exists between peace and war. You know, in our generation, we know what peace looks like. We know what war looks like, or certainly people remember what war looks like. Well, what we now have is something in between. And these are the famous Russian little green men in Crimea, in Ukraine. But, you know, what is our relationship with Russia at the moment? Russia has assassinated one person on British soil. It's tried to assassinate another. It's had the most extraordinary intrusion into American official computer networks, and I'm sure in many cases some of ours. An intrusion in the United States, which they are still not sure how deep or how permanent it has actually gone. Are we at peace with Russia, or are we not at peace with Russia? It's extremely complex. And in this grey zone, the media, the battle of competing narratives becomes more and more important. And everybody realizes this. I mean, here you have General Mike Mullen, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States, General Stanley McChrystal, former commander of ISAF in Afghanistan, making this point of how important this battle for ideas, the battle for what used to be called, I suppose, hearts and minds is. And it's interesting, it's shared by the other side too. Here you have some of the key Islamic State Al-Qaeda figures saying in their own rather convoluted terms very much the same thing. This is one of the last meetings at the old NATO headquarters before they moved across the road. And I wanted to just use it to talk a little bit about where we get our information from, because that's undergone a dramatic change as well, and particularly at a time when controlling narratives is so important. Interesting sign there, no classified discussion in this area. I've never had a classified discussion with anybody in that area, and I've rarely been told anything by anybody at NATO that isn't the kind of standard boilerplate. And I mean, that's what you get. This is at NATO as well. You know, interviewing a British government minister as he goes in, the famous doorstep, as they call it. That's one of the obvious ways you gather information. And of course, governments are using the new media of information distribution themselves. Currently underway in the Black Sea, exercise Sea Breeze. So the British Embassy is tweeting out about that. You have that on the left. On the right-hand side, you have the Russians tweeting, or the Russian Embassy, in this case, tweeting in English their view of the whole thing. Competing narratives, the dash of HMS Defender through Ukrainian territorial waters as exercising the right of international free passage. Well, of course, the Russians played this up as a major drama in so many ways. But then, of course, just by coincidence, there was a BBC correspondent and a male correspondent on the ship. And as we found by the documents that were left at a bus stop somewhere, I think it was, the British government did this quite deliberately. They knew the likely impact. They wanted to be able to manage that narrative. That is why the two correspondents were on board. But there are lots of interesting new sources of information that are not dependent on governments. There's an organization called Bellingcat, which is a kind of network of independent news providers that particularly focus on security and defense issues. This is one of the studies. They're famous for this. They basically, through geolocation of photos, using CCTV material that was sent to them, still material that was sent to them, they were able to track the Buk missile launcher that shot down, you remember the Dutch airliner, wasn't it? No, it was Indonesia. I can't remember whose airliner it was. There were lots of Dutch people on board, but the airliner that was shot down by separatists or possibly the Russian military, more likely, over Ukraine. They were able to identify the exact vehicle, to follow its passage into Ukraine, and so on. That's a dramatically new kind of source. Similarly, believe it or not, there's a Russian organization which is called, let me just check, the Conflict Intelligence Team, which began in May 2014 in response to the conflict in eastern Ukraine. And quite extraordinarily, they survive in Russia. They put out some remarkable material about Russian casualties in Syria. They follow things like the Facebook postings of Russian soldiers as they go through the Bosphorus on a landing ship en route to Syria and things like that. So here you have two recent pieces from them, one talking about a Russian convoy spotted in the Crimea, another looking at tracking railway trains. I mean, the Russians still use rail transport for their mass troop movements on a very large scale. So that's another interesting source. And then, of course, you had the widespread use of commercial satellite imaging. There was a time when the United States were the only people who had access to satellites. Even if NATO wanted to show you a satellite photo, it would take a week maybe to get clearances from the Americans and so on. Well, now you have academics, you have think tanks, you have all sorts of media as well, who buy satellite photos from commercial firms, which have absolutely sufficient resolution to see all sorts of interesting things. This is a recent piece from the Washington Post, where some academic arms control experts were pointing to a whole sort of farm of, I suppose you could call it that, intercontinental ballistic missile silos being built by the Chinese. You have people who follow very closely North Korea's nuclear program and use similarly satellite photos of this is the North Korean nuclear facility in Yongbyon. So I've talked about changes in the media and in conflict itself. I think, though, and I've alluded to this, and I don't really have any slides, but I think the changes in society are as significant. Think back to the demonstrations against the Iraq War, for example. You can't count on consensus or cohesion anymore. Look at the way the United States has been riven by the so-called culture wars. To some extent, there is a reflection of that here. Defense, the salience of defense issues is much lower, so therefore it has a much lower call perhaps on resources. There's less knowledge, less military experience, which again, as I've noted, is very different from the world most of us grew up in. The media is less interested in defence. The BBC, as part of its coming, I retired from the BBC as one of two defence correspondents in September of last year. I found the other day that there's even talk now of getting rid of the defence correspondent post completely. Attention spans are lower, competing information sources, people are much more conspiratorial, much more willing to look at conspiracy views of politics and so on. So it makes it all much harder. And that's particularly a problem for a country like Britain with, as I say, very limited resources in many ways, but very significant global ambitions.
And how do these huge and enormously expensive aircraft carriers actually operate?
Well, an aircraft carrier, as its name implies, carries aircraft.
Yes. And what sort of aircraft?
Well, I'm sorry you asked the question, because at the moment we can afford to either have the carriers or the aircraft, but not both.
And never a truer word was said. This is a nice photo. It rather emphasizes the problem. This is, as you know, HMS Queen Elizabeth, which is currently went through the Suez Canal the other day. It's currently on this massive voyage to show the flag and so on. But it has rather more American F-35s, Marine Corps F-35s, I think 8 British ones, 10 American ones. The Americans rather nicely, as you see in this photo, have put on the tail fin, as they do on their own ships, the name of the ship that it's deployed to, which is a nice gesture. Now, is this a very sensible piece of interoperability, which indeed other navies with small carriers in their cases have been doing with the Americans? That's certainly true. Is it, though, as the comedy skit shows, a sort of rather embarrassing underpinning of the fact that we can have the carrier, but we can't at this stage afford to build the Britain's own fleet of jets to operate it successfully?